Good evening. It's always a privilege for God's people to get together and think about that which is eternal and sacred while we're in a very temporary and changing world. Again, just don't want to be too repetitive, but if you are visiting, there's outlines on the communion table, and especially tonight, it would be helpful to do that. And for those watching online, Kristen, it's up to the right. There's a box or something they can click to download the notes when they come, and especially tonight, it would be helpful. What we're going to do tonight is look at, and I just use the term, a survey of the Jewish exiles in Babylon. And some things quickly by review, and then especially when we come to the second page, we're going to go back and pull a chart out to kind of look at the last 5 kings in Judah, because we are going to be introduced to one of them. And this is a very personal thing, and everyone would do this differently. But one of the things that I wanted my kids to know by the time they were 5, and this isn't what everybody should do, but that's just what we wanted to do. But I wanted my kids to know, obviously, the books of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and have a peg for each one. But I wanted them to know the 12 sons of Jacob, because how often as you read through the story do you come across different tribes and different things? And if you know who the sons are, then that helps you. And then we also then wanted to know all the kings of the southern kingdom. And, children like repetition. They're not dumb. If you do this at evening, they get to stay up a little bit longer if you're doing this. And we just have a 3x5 card, and we just start Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, Uzzah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amnon, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. And just by working through that and doing the repetition, the reason that that's important is that as you read through most of the prophets, something will be said historically, and then one of those kings will be, or in some cases 2 or 3 of them will be mentioned. And if you know something about the kings, then you have, can I use the word a peg? You have a peg then to then put the context for that particular book in. And one of the things that, and again, thinking when we were talking about Joseph and Daniel and these young men taken away as late teenagers, never to return, none of us know where our children are going to worship in their lifetimes. I mean, geographically and otherwise, we just don't know. And I always felt like, even if it's a Bible class or whatever, if I have given them some kind of a context and a peg for every major event and story in the Bible, can I say it this way? Then they don't have that deer in the headlight look. Like, okay, what are we talking about? Our middle one had a doll named Sarah, and we did try to watch Sarah a few times, but I mean, if you just carry Sarah everywhere you go, we finally had Sarah 2 come along, but everywhere Heather went, she had Sarah, and she would hold her and talk to her. Well, she's 3 years old, and she drops Sarah on the floor. So very gracefully, I get an elbow and a knee, and I pick her up, and she gets Sarah. And as she's settling into my lap, I'm holding her, and she's holding Sarah. And the preacher said, now, today we're going to study about Nehemiah. And Heather tells Sarah, we're going to be talking about building the walls of Jerusalem today. So do you see what I'm saying? They don't have to know everything about all the details, but if they know something about it, they bring a context to it. And you know what I'm saying about the deer in the headlight look. Some people think, okay, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so a part of what we're going to do tonight is that these 4 young men are carried into captivity, But we do have some historical references, both back to Jerusalem and some things that are happening in exile. And our window tonight, is because there will be a lot said about Babylonians and people in other nations, we're just going to notice the things that are said in Daniel about the Jewish exiles at this particular point. When you just look at the book as a whole, the first 6 chapters are just biographical historical narrative. And we'll look at those before we close tonight. And that's the part that everything from Bible stories and growing up in class, VBSs and all these other things, the young men thrown in the fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den, all of those other things are just very kind of straightforward, and it's a running historical narrative, and that makes the first part of the book. So if you look at 1:1, chapters 1 through 5 will tell the stories of Daniel and his 3 friends as political hostages in the royal Babylonian court. When we come to chapter 6, this is going to be a major transition internationally. After he interprets the handwriting on the wall, the Babylonian Empire falls that night. And so chapter 6 is then an entirely different world ruler. The Medes and the Persians are going to take over, and Daniel is going to rise, first of all, to the top of the Babylonian royal court, and then after the Persians take over, he'll be rising to the top of that. And as we've mentioned earlier, and we'll see this when we come to this, he's an old man by the time he's thrown into the lion's den, but he is in the second international royal court and rising to the top when that happens. But the 2 asterisks before 1:2 to me are really important tonight. And I'm thinking about the word spiritual identity. That has just become a really significant term for me, because we mentioned this verse recently. Like, for example, Paul's going to say, do not be shaped by this world's present way of thinking. Do not be conformed. And again, that's a passive confirmation, something that's shaping us. Don't be shaped by this present world's way of thinking. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And transformed is our word metamorphosis. And the same way that we go from a tadpole to a frog, we go from a cocoon to a butterfly, then Paul is saying, don't let this present world shape you into its mold, but what we're called to do is to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, so that you may prove what is that perfect and acceptable will of God. And this challenge is especially great if you have been torn out of your homeland, if you are carried off as a captive, and if you are living in this glorious city, especially Babylon in the early days. And as we mentioned last week, did you take that one last look over your shoulder to the captured city of Jerusalem before you're carried off, never to come back? And we mentioned this, there's a whole group of these when you kind of track them down, but the same period of time, Psalms 137 just simply says, how can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Our captives required of us with mirth, oh, you Jews, sing us one of those songs of Zion. You know, it's like, okay, guys, let's belt it out. Let's sing one of those songs of Zion. And the psalmist says, how can I sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But if I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand wither, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I do not hold you above my highest joy. And here are these captives like Daniel, hundreds of miles away, living in a foreign country, and keeping alive their spiritual identity as is associated with the city of Jerusalem. And with both Ezekiel gets to go back in visions, and God transports him back and sees some terrible things while he's there. But I just try to imagine what it would be like to be taken from my home at 17 and never, ever, ever physically go back. This last year, I read a couple of missionary biographies of our workers in Africa. And this particular family, and I just, I can't tell you my admiration for this. This first family, and they're going by ship. So you go to wherever it is, New Orleans or New York, and you get a ship to London, but you don't book it all the way. The next place, and you go down to the dock and try to find when's the next ship, and then you find your way there. They came home for the first time after 15 years. Wayne, how different is home if you have not been home for 15 years? How different are you? You know, our trips were 3 years apart, and when I listen to our workers from third world countries say, I go into Crest and I get physically ill because there are too many choices. It wasn't quite that bad, but we had come back and we're in Crest, and Sheila just says, I just want one kind of cereal. I don't want to have to look at 60 different kinds of boxes. I just want one kind of cereal. And if you've been gone for decades, as these people, 15 years, they came back, had connections with Cersei. George Benson met them and said, I want to write your present supporters. If you need some more support when you go back, I want to help you. And Kelly, they go back and they don't come back the next time until 9 years. So in 25 years, they've come home twice. And then I read that and I think, what would it be like to never come home? This is totally silly, but it's just reality. It's surprising how nice an Oreo cookie tastes halfway around the world. I mean, we had all kinds of wonderful, they would call them biscuits, but my mom, of course we could do it by sea then, my mom would send care packages. And those of you who know my delightful younger brother, Mom had sent, she'd gone to the grocery store and bought a box of Oreo cookies, and she made the mistake of mailing them to the church building and not to their house. And so Kent's middle daughter said, Mom, in their house, in the kitchen, I can smell Oreo cookies. And Nancy said, okay, Haley, you're just imagining that. We haven't seen any Oreo cookies for a long time. And the third time, Haley said, Mom, there are Oreo cookies in our kitchen. And they take everything out of the shelves, they get to looking, and over the refrigerator is the recipe books. And behind the recipe books was an open package of Oreo cookies. When they get checking, half of the box is gone because it's been at the church office. And he had just brought one of those home, and then Haley could smell that in the kitchen, and she says, Mom, there are Oreo cookies in our house. Now, that's trivial. Our song leader at Eastside for many years had a 4-octave voice. And Gerald Southern was captured by the Germans, was in France. And when he was able to escape, there was 8 inches of snow. He doesn't know if he's headed toward the Atlantic or headed toward Paris. and you can't go talk to people because you might get caught, and you can't do anything. And I've just heard him say, and I just shudder even thinking about this. He said, in 9 days, I found one chicken in a chicken house. And he said, I asked forgiveness for theft, and then I asked for strength to eat as much raw chicken as I could before it froze. And in 9 days, that's all he had to eat. I promise you, I would be thinking, if I ever get home, I'm going to eat a Hershey's candy bar whenever I want to. But can you imagine going 9 days and the only thing you've had to eat is a raw chicken? And these are physical things, but I just want you to kind of put yourself in these young men's place, because how do you maintain spiritual identity when no one virtually around you, but just this small group, shares your values, your beliefs, and your God? And you are the captives, and you are the ones who will be made fun of, and you are the ones who are different. Again, very minor. Every time you open your mouth in a foreign country, you announce that you're different. Our son starts to school, and he comes home and he says, Dad, and I said, yes, matey. He said, everybody in my class has figured out I talk funny. So what do you say to a 6-year-old when he says, everybody in my class has figured out that I talk funny? And at some point, you either revel in being different, or then you become like what's around you. And just think the enormous spiritual challenge that these young men faced. In 1:2, when you come to starting chapter 7, we're going to have 4 different symbolic visions. And Lord willing, these will come up maybe even into the fall. But basically, God chooses to give to Daniel the roadmap for what is going to take place in world history for the next 500 years until Jesus comes. I'm in a seminar on Jeremiah. My teacher was not a believer in terms of inspiration. And we read some things from Daniel, and he just said, these things are so precisely and so clearly given, they could only have been written down after the event. And I'm sitting here thinking, inspiration? God's Spirit told him what was going to happen. And I thought, what an enormous compliment to the inspiration of God that someone in our day reads this, and as an ancient historian says, these details are so precise and so clear and so careful. This is just exactly how it happened. His only possibility was this had to be written down afterwards. And as the center of prophecy moves from Jerusalem, then in great detail, then God is going to reveal to Daniel through these 4 visions, this is what's going to take place, and we would say, till the coming of Christ. Do you remember in Peter where he talks about that the prophets they looked and they peered into the future, and they wondered within them what was that Spirit that was speaking to them and what was going to take place, and they were only told that they were serving us. And Daniel has no idea of the precision of how God's going to work this out, but this is what takes place. We'll talk about this later. I didn't write this down. But in the first 6 chapters, God gives Daniel the ability to interpret visions. And in the last 6 chapters, then God gives Daniel visions about what is going to take place. And that's something, Lord willing, that we'd look at later. If you look under 1:3, at the very end, there's just some very specific instructions given to Daniel. And here's a quotation. God is speaking to Aaron and Miriam as they have opposed Moses. And God says, if there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak to him in a dream. Not so with Moses. He is faithful in all my house. I speak to him mouth to mouth. Some translations will say face to face. And I read that a while back and I thought, that's our friend Daniel. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. So when you come to number 2, before we get to the middle of the page, and we'll touch on these in more detail because of the visions later, but this is still helpful to remember. Daniel's lifespan includes the rise and the fall of 3 earthly kingdoms. And Assyria, when he's a very young man, is going to fall in 612. The Battle of Carchemish will take place. The Babylonians, as he starts growing toward a teenager, will take over and will be in control until 539. And then, as we're going to see, the primary king of the Medes and the Persians, Cyrus the Great, at the end of Daniel's life, is going to conquer the Babylonians, and this will begin a 200-year of Persian control. So here are the definitions in terms of the kingdoms around them. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And then when you come to the end of chapter 1, Daniel just kind of gives us this parentheses for his life. And Daniel was there in Babylon until the first year of King Cyrus. And like I said, Cyrus is going to be the ruler of the Medes and the Persians. So Daniel's a part of the first captives that go into captivity. Some will say 606, some 605. And here's the first 2 verses of Daniel. And again, just little windows of information about the Jewish exiles. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And this to me is the really critical part. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And so when you look at number 1, God is going to promise Abraham about 2,000, David 1,000, and the promises are different, but God says to Abraham, now through you I'm going to bless all nations. At 1,000, God says, you're not going to build of me a house, I'm going to make of you a house, and one of your descendants will sit on the throne forever. And by the time we come to the end of the kings, which will take place in Daniel's life, there is not a king on the throne for 500 years. And you can see why the Jews are so anxious in the ministry of Jesus, are you the king? And even in John 6, after the feeding of the 5,000, seeing they were going to come and make him a king by force. And they've been reading this passage and saying, God, it's been 500 years and we don't have a king. The other thing that's going to add to the confusion is that, and the apostles are a part of this, they obviously are thinking about a physical king. They're thinking about someone on the throne in Jerusalem and the idea that he is going to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And as we mentioned recently, after he's made purification for sins, he will sit down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. And that is going to be the fulfillment, but no one saw it coming because for 500 years it's like they're looking, where is this physical king? Now, this will be a review for some of us. We'll go through this quickly, but I think this is really, really important. As we go through these promises, and with Abraham, we're 2,000 years down to Christ, with David 1,000, twice we are down to the heartbeat of one little boy for the promise to be fulfilled. 1:1, Athaliah is going to kill all of the king's sons, and they anticipate what's going on, and they grab this one little boy, and they hide him from her, Joash. And she is such a witch, she is so evil, they get to thinking there is one place that we can hide a 7-year-old boy and she'll never find him, and where is it? In the temple. She is so evil, the last place that she will ever go is in the temple. Kelly, how old are your grandsons? okay? But take the 5-year-old. You try to hide a 5-year-old, and you turn around and he's gone. You know, you just think this is a real challenge, even in a city like Jerusalem. May I say it this way? They turned the temple into a playpen. I'm sure you're going to have guards and other things, but we have to keep this. There's one little boy that she doesn't know is alive, and we have to keep him away from her, and we're down to one heartbeat. And if she had her way, she would have wiped out the entire line. And then he is going to be anointed as the king when he's 7, and of course she's going to holler treason before they kill her, but the promise is down to one heartbeat. The same thing is going to happen here toward the end, and I'm at 1:22. After Zedekiah, he's the last of the reigning kings, and we'll see this on a chart in a second. The third time that the city is conquered, and we'll come to this on the second page, but the third time that the city is conquered, Zedekiah is the last king, and he's rebelled for the third time. And I will always remember Brother McCord talking about this because it's so gruesome. I mean, you just can't even hardly imagine. The city's captured, they capture the king, and they bring his sons, literally, physical sons, before him, and they kill his sons before him, and then they put his eyes out. So you just think about the transition from a sight person to a blind person, and the last thing that you see are your own sons being killed, and then they put your eyes out. And this is the last king that's going to be in Jerusalem. However, look at 1:23. God is going to preserve his promise to Abraham because he is going to send a nephew of Zedekiah to Babylon when he's 8 years old. And we'll see this on a chart, but just kind of anticipate. We're going to have Josiah, and there's going to be 3 sons, but the middle son is going to have a grandson. And when the grandson is 8 years old, the Babylonian king takes him into captivity, replaces him with his uncle, and when his uncle and the sons are killed, then all of the royal line in Judah is destroyed, but God has sent an 8-year-old little boy into Babylon, and he has family. And when you read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, you're going to have, there was Jeconiah, there was Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, who we're going to see, and then Abiud, and then Achan, and Eliezer, and Mattan, and Jacob, and Joseph, who was the father of Jesus. And the last part of the genealogy from the end of the Old Testament down to Jesus is going to be preserved because in his providence, God sends an 8-year-old little boy into captivity, and he lives there, he has a family, he has sons, and he is one of the descendants of David, and this is how God fulfills the promise both to Abraham and both to David. And in both cases, one is a 7-year-old little boy, and the other is an 8-year-old little boy. Only the providence of God could bring those things about. So when you look at the second asterisk just before the bottom, this is going to be from Ezra. These are the people in the providence who came out of the captivity of the exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried captive into Babylonia. They returned to Jerusalem and Judea, each to his own town. And notice, they came with Zerubbabel. So it's going to be Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel. And they are going to bring the materials as was given by Cyrus, king of Persia. So if you'll turn the page over, and this will help you to kind of visually see what we just talked about. And we did a part of this back when we did the walk through the Bible, and there's a reference for that. There's more detail. But the first time I saw this chart, John Willis did this in just a Bible study book, and I just thought this really helps me to see what's going on, because the last of the really good kings is Josiah. and he's going to rule for 31 years, and we'll see just sketches in a second. So if you go from Josiah over to the left, there's Jehoaz, and he's going to reign for 3 months. Jehoiakim is going to reign for 11 years. And then the one that's really important is Jehoiachin. And like I said, he's a little boy, but he only reigns for 3 months and 10 days. And Nebuchadnezzar takes this little boy into Babylon as a captive and then puts his uncle, Zedekiah, back up with one of the brothers on the throne. And so from Josiah, 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons are going to be king. And while Jehoiachin is only going to be a king for 3 months and 10 days before he's taken into Babylon, he is going to be the continuation and the fulfillment of the seed promise that God made. I just had splendid Bible classes when I was at Oklahoma Christian, but probably, and this is kind of strange, but probably my favorite Bible class was Ezra and Nehemiah. We got married that summer. I was preaching twice on Sunday and didn't have anything else going on, so I took 20 hours that summer trying to finish 2 degrees in just a little over 4 years. And the Bible class that was offered by Bill Jones was Ezra and Nehemiah. And it was such a refreshing thing to look. And the thing that just, I'd walk around campus and it just kept ringing in my ears. We have all of these godly people for all these centuries. And what happens if at the very end, the wheels just fall off the wagon and everything just fails? And these people in captivity and their faithfulness in spite of the faithlessness of the majority of the people, and then here they are in foreign lands. It's the faith of those people that kept the seed promise alive that God is going to have for 2,000 years with Abraham and 1,000 years with David. So here are just the briefest highlights. And notice the first asterisk. The king of Egypt and the king of Babylon in this last years are going to appoint 3 kings, and all 3 kings are going to be descendants of David. So first of all is Josiah. Like I said, he reigns for 31 years. One of the very best. For whatever reason, he goes out to try to keep Pharaoh Necho from coming from Egypt to go up to fight, and he gets killed tragically. And after Josiah, the rest of the kings are not good. So here's Jehoaz. He's 23 years old. He reigns for 3 months. And then the king of Egypt is going to depose him and then is going to appoint a brother who is Jehoiakim, and he'll reign for 11 years. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to deport him to Babylon and appoint his son. And then if you'll notice, here is 606, the first time Jerusalem's captured. It's going to be captured 3 times, just in very brief intervals. And after the first capture, then, and this is when Daniel, if you'll notice, Daniel becomes an exile in 606. Then here is this 8-year-old little boy. He reigns for 3 months and 10 days, and Nebuchadnezzar chooses to take him to Babylon. And that's, as I said, this is going to be the providence of God to preserve the lineage down to Jesus. And this 8-year-old little boy is going to live the rest of his life in Babylon. And then his uncle is going to be king, changes his name to Zedekiah. The city's captured a second time, and this group of captives, then Ezekiel, our other major prophet, then he is also carried into captivity. And then Zedekiah is going to reign for 11 years, and then there's the third rebellion, and then this is when he and his sons are killed. And so a lot takes place, but this is going to be our bottom line tonight. No matter how dark the night may be, the biblical writers keep saying God is still in control. And I'm processing just a second. Well, let me say it this way. We are to be good citizens of the nation that we belong to. And like God's going to tell Jeremiah, seek the welfare of the city where you are. And we're to support whatever our government is. That's a part of it. However, we are always to have a higher allegiance to the kingdom of God than we have to any kingdom on earth. And I'm just an absolute patriot. I love our country. I love the good things about our country. And there's obviously a lot that's wrong. But between junior and senior year in 4-H, 2 busloads went to Washington, D.C. for 10 days. And it was fabulous. We had senators come and speak, and all kinds of things happened. And there were kids there from 10 different states living in this area. And like we go down the Potomac River and go to George Washington's home. But one evening they turned us loose, I don't know, 3 or 4 o'clock, and they said, be here at 10 o'clock tonight, and Washington, D.C. is yours. So 8 of us decided we were going to run up the Washington Memorial singing Oklahoma from the first step to the top. Not all of us sang all the time, and it's a lot higher once you get on the inside than it looks on the outside, and you could touch the walls and there was moisture there. But of the 8 of us, somebody was singing the whole time, and then we got to the top and caught our breath and got to serenade everybody in the Washington Memorial with a rousing version of Oklahoma. Love our country. But regardless of our attachment to a physical kingdom, and this is what our song is going to say, the kingdoms of earth pass away one by one, but the kingdom of heaven remains. It is built on a rock, and the Lord is its king, and forever and ever he reigns. And my favorite verse about David is in Acts 13. For many years, David was the man after God's own heart, and what an amazing verse. But in that same sermon, we're going to hear David served the purpose of God in his generation. And that's what Daniel is going to do. That's what Esther is going to do. That's what Nehemiah is going to do. And that's what we're called to do. And whatever freedoms that we have, one of the greatest uses of those freedoms is to advance and spread the kingdom to as many different places and make the church as strong as we can in our lifetime. That's part of what I think God puts us in that situation, and that's part of our call. So here's our closing thoughts. We'll come to this in chapter 9. An entire section, Daniel is going to confess the sins of God's people, which caused them to be in captivity. And I just picked a verse out. All Israel has transgressed your law, and they've turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and the oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. And you'll see this both in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. God tells Moses, you tell the people and you tell Joshua, once you go into the land, I want half of you on Mount Gerizim, I want half of you on Mount Ebal, and I want a list of blessings. If you keep the law, this is how I'm going to bless you. And I want a list of curses read. If you do not keep the law, this is what's going to happen. And this is going to be around 1500. And when you read the book of Jeremiah in the late 600s, going into the top of the 500s, you will find nearly line for line the curses brought upon God's people 1,000 years later. So even though he's in the royal court, even though he's hundreds of miles away, Daniel's very conscious we are in captivity because as a nation we have sinned and we have broken the law that God gave through Moses. Number 2 is very interesting. We'll do this quickly, but Daniel and Ezra have parts of them that are written both in Hebrew but then in Aramaic. And Aramaic is going to be the primary language of the Babylonians. And if you'll notice, the Hebrew is chapter 1 down to chapter 2, verse 4. And then it will begin again in chapter 8 through the end of the book. So 2:1, and notice quickly, the Chaldeans, magicians, astrologers, whatever your translations will say, they're going to answer the king in Aramaic, and all of this is in Hebrew. And then when they answer them, then the text from Hebrew goes into Aramaic, but it stays in Aramaic all the way through chapter 7. So the book starts in the native language of the Hebrews and will be in Hebrew. And then when they answer the king in their native tongue, then from chapter 2, verse 5 through chapter 7, then the heart of Daniel is written in Aramaic, which is the language of the captors, and then we'll go back to the language of Hebrew. And so, 3:1, God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to capture Jerusalem. That'll be a part of chapter 1. We are introduced to 4 young Hebrew young men living in Babylonian exile. And then I find 3:2 very interesting. A chiasm is something that the top 2, the middle 2, and then the very middle 2 will have the same thought. And if you'll notice, I'm going to do A. There's a dream of a statue representing 4 kingdoms in Daniel 2. And then look at the bottom one, I'll call it A prime. There's a vision of beast representing 4 kingdoms in chapter 7. Then if you look at B, a court conflict, 3 friends in the fiery furnace, Daniel 3. Go down to B prime, a court conflict, Daniel's in the lion's den, is in Daniel 6. And then in the middle, C, there's a court contest interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then C prime, a court contest interpreting the writing on the wall. And this is something that happens throughout, especially, it's in the New Testament as well. But the Aramaic part of the book, the beginning and the end, the in-between sections, and the very middle sections, all are very similar in thought, and it's like you go in order and then you go in reverse, and that's the term for a chiasm. So this is our last thoughts today. Daniel 1 through 6 is literal, and it's a story, and I use the term story like history, of 4 Hebrews struggling with spiritual identity and captivity. And the same way as we talked about Joseph, I just have the most profound respect. From memory, I think we figured out Joseph lives in Egypt for 93 years. And he tells them, when God brings you out, you carry my bones out of here. But he's faithful to God the whole time. And then here's Daniel carried into captivity as a young man, rises to the top of the Babylonian, rises to the top of the Persian Empire. And as we're going to see later, 3 times a day, what does he do? Goes, opens his window, and prays toward Jerusalem. And even though physically he is in a foreign land, his heart and his soul are tied up with his God, who the original temple was in Jerusalem. So the readers of Daniel are in foreign captivity because of their sin, but the book is going to assure them that God is still in control of world events, and he is in control of their lives, regardless of how dark it is at the moment. Just accidentally ran into 4 different American families the 12 years we lived in Sydney that had moved to Australia to survive the nuclear fallout that took place when when the Russians and the Americans killed each other, and they had done trade winds to see where the nuclear fallout was going to be and all this stuff. And then they were really disgusted. We went and built an air base in Australia so they might become a target as well. I tried not to laugh. I mean, you think about this. How much they've moved halfway around the world. I mean, how far is it to Cersei? 5 hours. Can you imagine moving to Australia because you're going to survive the nuclear? I mean, they had gone to all kinds of research and everything else, and then they were just torqued. They were so frustrated that we had built an air base in Australia and they might be a target. And none of them had children. And the comment was, the world is such an evil place, I just can't see raising children in it. And I didn't say this because you don't throw your pearls before pigs, but guess what I thought? You have never read your Old Testament. One, you don't know how worse the world can get. And two, you don't know that God is still in control, regardless of how dark it is. And that's going to be one of the bottom lines that is going to keep coming up through the book of Daniel. God bless. What a privilege to be with you, and hope you have a blessed evening.